Thanks, Robbie. Definitely sounds like you're going to be very busy in the next 6 months. We're now going to tack a bit. We have John Fitzgerald, who is the CEO of SuperNode. John's a lot of experience, power systems and grid infrastructure. John was the Director of Grid Development and Interconnection in AirGrid. Prior to that, helped deliver the East-West Interconnector, and prior to that he was actually in ESB International, developing a lot of international energy infrastructure projects. So John's presentation is titled "A Renewable Opportunity, Grid We Need to Realise It." Thanks, John.
Thank you, Rory, and I'd like to thank IWEA for this opportunity. We've heard a lot of speakers this afternoon talk about the best models. I'm going to take a different view and look a bit further out and into the future in a European context, because I think trying to solve our climate challenges in isolation is going to prove very, very difficult for many countries, including Ireland. We're long on renewables and short on demand, and that poses some significant challenges. So I'm just going to talk about the future, and really, I think it was Abraham Lincoln said that the best way to predict the future was to create it yourself. So the focus is pretty much on the future, and the future, as we see it, is out to 2050. And I was delighted when Ursula von der Leyen, I won't use too many acronyms, but it's a long name to say, but in her maiden speech, she said, "I want Europe to become the first climate neutral continent in the world by 2050. Now that's quite a statement. And she went on to say, to make this happen, we must take bold steps together. Our current goal of reducing our emissions by 40% by 2030 is not enough. So all the targets we have already been likely to change, and there's a strong possibility the bar is going to be raised. And that presents challenges. I think in relation to what can electricity do, I think it's the vector for decarbonise our economies. In addition to that, we'll have demand, transport, heating and cooling, industrial feedstock. They'll all drive an increase in demand, and electricity is the only way to decarbonise. That's going to really increase the amount of electricity we need. Power to gas, power to X, it's a delivery mechanism. It requires renewable energy to produce it in a carbon neutral manner. Efficiency, self-production, demand-side management, storage, smart grids, they'll all help. But the bottom line is we need a lot more renewables. So anybody who thinks we're at the end of renewables, I don't even think we're at the beginning of the end. So this is a view we have of 2050. So you can see electricity demand, and this is across Europe. So it's about 3,500 terawatt hours per year across Europe. And then if you look out to 2030, which is not an end point, but just an intermediate point, we see it increasing to about 5,000 with the electrification of transport and heat. And then out to 7,800 terawatt hours. So that's more than a doubling in demand for electricity out to 2050. So we've benchmarked this with the European Commission, Eurelectric, SUE, and also with the International Energy Association. And these numbers, others have lower numbers, but they're all doing one thing, they're trending upwards, and there's an acknowledgement that renewables, we need a lot more of them. In terms of, if you take a step back and say, regardless what model we employ, where are the best resources if we're going to turn off the carbon machines? Where are the best resources? And you'll recognize this is the radiation map for Europe. You can see the Mediterranean basin is where our very best solar resources are. We're in further north here, and this is a recent update by the European Union where they've updated the wind maps for Europe, and you'll see the wind speed at 100 metres above ground. You'll see the best resources are in the north, and particularly in the northwest, so Ireland, Scotland, Norway, the Baltics to a lesser extent, but these are very good wind speeds. What do the wind speeds mean? Well, this is the typical translation to output for a wind turbine, and you can see that at 70%, at 10 metres per second, you're getting 70% of your output. If you're down at 5 metres per second, you're down to 10%. So it falls quite dramatically. So you want to get your higher load factors, your higher efficiencies. So you need to go where the best wind is to get the best outcome from your turbine. And this was earlier in the Renewable UK presentation. I think it came across strongly that it reduces your costs if you've got a better load factor. I was quite taken with the load factors expected from the next round in the UK. I think it was in the high 50s, 58%. So that's about double what you can get onshore. So you can see this in Germany, where the onshore auctions are producing 6 pence plus per kilowatt hour. The latest French offshore, this is for offshore production of renewables, 4.4 cent per kilowatt hour. So there's a big swing there, and the technology is changing. So what does this mean? Well, it's a challenge and an opportunity. What it's telling us is that in Europe, because of our geography, the best renewable resources are at the periphery. The best solar is in the Mediterranean. The best wind is in the North Sea, the North-West Atlantic, the Baltics, and so on. Dispersing our renewable resource will obviate their variability. We're getting very high load factors in areas, but nevertheless, the weather changes. We believe that, and in addition to what's in the pipeline today, these are the plans that people are, I use the word agonizing over the best way to implement in individual countries. On top of that, by 2050, we believe another 500 gigawatts of offshore wind, predominantly because of the characteristics of it, and 450 gigawatts of solar will be required on top of what's in the system today. So that's a huge challenge. Now, the grid we have, and it's just the way we are, the grid we've designed was a carbon grid. It was based on petrochemicals, it was built for thermal generation, and as electrification becomes the vector for decarbonisation, it's not going to be fit for purpose. It's not big enough. It won't be able to do it. You'll see it in Robbie's presentation and those from earlier, where they can shoehorn a little bit in. If our ambition in Ireland is 25, 75 gigawatts, if that's the opportunity and the resource, if you look at our system, it's a 6 gigawatt system. So there's no way the grid is going to be able to accommodate that. So we have a big challenge. The price of RES is falling dramatically, but the cost of connecting those, as the best sites near the coast, the best transmission stations, the Arklows, the pool bags, as they get gobbled up by capacity, where are the new guys going to connect to? The same is true in Germany, Holland, right across the piece. Where are the new guys going to connect to? Public acceptance. I spent years in grid development. It's very difficult to develop new infrastructure, particularly above ground infrastructure in Europe, which is very populated, particularly around the demand centres. So we need new technology, we need new solutions, we need new infrastructure. So now I'm going to talk about my company, SuperNode. So it's a spin-off from Mainstream Renewable Power, which is Eddie O'Connor's company, which he founded. Eddie developed the first offshore wind farm in Ireland. We were leaders in 2004. We've fallen back, and I think it's still the only offshore wind farm in Ireland, but now it's at the back of the queue in terms of leadership in technology. What SuperNode is a technical company, and we're working with OEMs to try and reduce the cost of connecting remote renewables. So we see that is the pain point for developers. That is what's going to drive the levelized cost of energy up, and that is the point we need to attack. So we're developing a system which will collect the energy, turn it into DC to extend the range, and then route it to demand centres, and do that more cheaply. We believe we can do it 40 to 50% of the cost, and more importantly, 40 to 50% of the footprint. So footprint is an issue in terms of congestion, in terms of getting into demand centres, in terms of public acceptability. So these are the things that we are aiming to do. Not this side of 2030, we're really focusing beyond the next 10 years. So that's really where we're targeting, and to connect up these systems. In terms of what do we mean by doing it more cheaply? Well, on your right there, you'll see an offshore platform, typical of the wind series that are put in the North Sea to serve the German and Dutch markets today. It employs HVDC. The platforms, they're quite large, they're quite expensive. We believe by using medium voltage and superconductors, we can actually do with a much smaller platform and obviate the huge costs associated with that. And that's how we can knock significant costs out of the system. Nowhere is that more important than in Ireland, where we have a huge resource with very little demand relative to that resource. In terms of the opportunity that we have in Ireland, and I think we should look at the opportunity, I think if we look to other markets like Scotland and what they've done is incredible. We're long in quality renewables, and Central Europe is short. So we need to get that renewable energy to Europe. It's not a domestic play, it's an export opportunity for Ireland. We've huge sea resource, we have the potential for hundreds of gigawatts. Will we develop hundreds of gigawatts? Perhaps not hundreds, but certainly tens and up to 100 gigawatts is possible. We have some of the best wind speeds in the world, over 12 meters per second, and with the technology coming with floating offshore, it's very deployable. The challenge is transmission. So what can we get if we grasp this opportunity, which I believe is in front of us right now, and it takes a long time to develop systems and so on. So new indigenous industries, to diversify job creation, regional development and renewal of coastal communities. So this is in the periphery where jobs are scarce, good jobs. Energy security without the need for annual fuel. We have 90% import of our fuel today. So we still have a huge dependence on importing fuel when CARB runs out. That will increase again. So here's a huge opportunity for us. Export revenue. If you're exporting energy, you can get there's remuneration for the state in terms of the seabed leases. The Crown Estate have deployed that model in Britain, and it's one we could employ here. Also, if you're going to be a leader, you have to lead from the front, and I think this offers Ireland an opportunity to lead for Europe the climate change agenda. It will avoid us to avoid penalties, which is looking at it negatively. We avoid penalties and we meet our responsibilities, but that's really a byproduct. In terms of an example, in Ireland, agriculture is the elephant in the room. Emissions from agriculture are almost 20 megatons of CO2 equivalent per annum. Coal and gas emissions in other parts of Europe are about 3/4 of a tonne per megawatt hour. So if you translate that 26 terawatt hours of energy from coal and gas, if we displace that with offshore wind, we'd offset the entire footprint of our agricultural sector. In the longer term, that won't get us out of jail, but it shows how we can address climate change in innovative ways and the opportunities. So that's about 5 gigawatts. So when you start thinking of this in an export manner rather than in a domestic manner, you start seeing opportunities. I think we all have a role to play. Like this room, there's a lot of energy in the room today and a lot of people here interested in this industry. I think we all have a role to play in convincing others what steps we need to take as a country to realise this ambition. And those steps, the first step is the most important, and that's for our leaders, our policymakers, to commit to develop renewables as an asset for export. I think that is a long-term vision, and it's being articulated, it's gaining in currency, but I think we have a role to play in convincing the policymakers to commit. That's placing a bet. And then to create an offshore renewable centre of excellence with industry and government. If you look to Scotland and to the UK, which I believe we can learn a lot from in terms of their journey over the past 10 years. In 2009, Scotland decided that this wasn't just a compliance exercise, it was an export opportunity. And they kicked off renewable centres. Today, the High Wind project is financed entirely by Equinor. It's based off Scotland. The European Offshore Wind Development Centre of Aberdeen, Vattenfall have developed innovative technology. This is creating industry opportunities, indigenous jobs in Scotland. We talked earlier about SSE and the Beatrice project and the benefits it's brought. All of these are having huge benefits, and it hasn't cost a lot of money for the taxpayer in Scotland. What you've seen is government showing leadership, government showing direction and giving certainty to industry, and capital flocking to that. So this can happen in Ireland, but we cannot follow. We need to pick new technologies, new innovations, and show the leadership and show it. I think a test and deployment centre would be a benefit for new technologies. There's no point using old technologies that others have proved. You won't get supply chain and indigenous jobs from that. You need somewhere where you can test innovative technology at scale, where the planning and consents have been screened, where there's a connection regime, and where developers can get a price for the power they produce. These are the three things that developers need, but I think the focus should be on innovation. I think spatial planning, we had a session earlier and they majored on this. I'll say I agree with everything that they said. There was a lot of acronyms and it was a bit bamboozling. I would say one of the big benefits that I've seen through development in Ireland as a developer and in the UK as a developer is the benefit of having an entity like the Crown Estate who are looking at the long-term asset and trying to monetize it. It gives a particular perspective rather than a minister being the landlord. I think there's benefit in having an entity that see the offshore as an asset and seek to commercialise it. I think their voice is powerful and can help the debate. That's my tuppence. I would like to encourage you all to support these steps and to do your bit in making the offshore in Ireland possible and do it in a European context, because in a domestic context, it's simply, I don't believe it can work. Thank you.